Good evening, everyone. First, everyone here in the room and everyone that was joining us online. I'm Pius Samuelson. I'm the Regents Professor of History, as well as Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and the Director of Jewish Studies at ASU. If you attended our previous events, you know that the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State is committed to disseminating knowledge about Jews and Judaism through guest lectures, research conferences, adult education courses, and historical exhibits. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have done many programs, public lectures, conferences, and so forth online. And that actually has increased our attendance, even though it's virtual attendance. This semester, we began by hosting Pamela Nadell from American University as our ex-dean scholar. And then her lecture was on Jewish women and the feminist revolution. We also held two lecture series, one on rabbis that shaped Jewish history, which Professor Stanley Mervis taught, and another one on ancient roots, Judaism, and ancient Christianity. That program featured three professors at ASU, Professor Hartung, Professor Mirguet, and Professor Langille. All these lectures were delivered via Zoom, but last week we tried for the first time to do a hybrid event when we hosted Professor Jonathan Fox from Bar-Ilan University, who lectured on why do people discriminate against Jews? And if you attended that, you know that he shared with us the result of longitudinal and quantitative research. The lecture last week is a nice segue to tonight's Lowe Family Lecture on Holocaust and Genocide Education, in which Professor Kurtzer of Brown University will focus on the silence of the Pope, Pius XII, and the SS Roundup of Rome's Jews. The Lowe Lecture Series on Holocaust and Genocide Education has funded several public lectures and research conferences. In January 2021, we held an international research conference on anti-Semitism in comparative perspectives. In October 2021, we held a conference on Jewish-Muslim relations through the ages, coexistence, and conflict. So Professor Kurtzer's visit to ASU and to Phoenix is organized as a partnership between the Center for Jewish Studies and Malikian Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies. And I thank the Lowe family for their ongoing support and involvement with Jewish studies, as well as to the Malikian Center for its collaboration with the Center for Jewish Studies. And now it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Professor David Kurtzer, our guest speaker for this evening. Professor Kurtzer is the Paul Dupi University Professor of Social Science, as well as Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies at Brown University. From 2006 to 2011, he also served as the Provost of Brown University. At Brown University, he founded and directed the Anthropological Demography Program, as well as the Politics, Culture, and Identity Research Program at the Watson Institute for International Studies. Professor Kurtzer's research focuses on Italian politics, society, and history, also on political symbolism and on anthropological demography. He is the past president of both the Social Science History Association and the Society for the Anthropology of Europe. Is also the co-founder and for many years the co-editor of the Journal of Modern Italian Studies. Professor Kurtzer, as I'm sure many of you know, is the author of numerous books. I will only mention three which are relevant to tonight's lecture. The most famous, well-known book is The Pope and Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XI and the Rise of Fascism in Europe. That book received the Pulitzer Prize in Biography in 2015. It was translated into 11 languages. Another book is The Pope Against the Jews, the Vatican's role in the rise of modern anti-Semitism. That too was translated into 9 languages. And a third book, which many of us at ASU are familiar with, is The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara. And it's a book that can be used in college level courses. It's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend actually all 3 books to you. Professor Kurtzer is the recipient of many awards and honors, including the Mararo Prize from the Society of Italian Historical Studies for the best book in Italian history, and he received this award twice. This evening, he's going to share with us his research from the forthcoming book, which will appear in June under the title, The Pope at War, Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler. So this lecture, in many ways, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Kurtzer, I believe this is the first time you speak about the book in public, right? So this is kind of a pre-launch launch of the book. We are very privileged in this matter, I would assume, because Professor Kurtzer has special relationship with Metropolitan Phoenix and with ASU. He's the son of Rabbi Morris Kurtzer and Julia Kurtzer, who lived in Scottsdale for many years. Rabbi Kurtzer was a Reform rabbi who was the director of interreligious affairs of the American Jewish Committee, as well as a member of the executive board of the Central Conference of American Rabbi. And last night, I learned from Susan Kurtzer that he was involved in the founding of Temple High here in Scottsdale. Did I get it right? Yes? So here we go, a special connection here, and we have some members of the family of Professor Kurtzer here with us tonight. After the passing away of Rabbi Kurtzer in 1983, the Kurtzer family established some scholarship to support Jewish studies at ASU, and over the years, the Morris and Julia Kurtzer Scholarship has supported many undergraduate and graduate students who travel to other countries, especially to do research or work in archives and special libraries. So we are very grateful for the generosity of the Kurtzer family. So if you're going to join us online, please put your questions in the Q&A function, and they will be presented selectively to Professor Kurtzer. And now, without further ado, let me invite Professor Kurtzer to the podium. The stage is yours, Professor Kurtzer.
Thank you, Hava. Oops, you took my text, Harry. You've taken my text. But
I took your text off. I didn't what was done at Harvard, right?
It's sort of a comedy routine we have organized. Well, thank you to Hava for inviting me to ASU, to the Malikian Center, Jewish Studies, to the Lowe family for sponsoring this lecture. As Hava mentioned, this is the first time will be publicly discussing a part of this new book. And so I'm quite interested in people's reaction, both those here and those who are zooming in. So let me get right to it. As the Nazis went about their systematic attempt to murder all the Jews of Europe during the Second World War, the Pope remained publicly silent. This much is known. The word Jew never escaped from the Pope's lips during World War II, during the Holocaust. Yet a heated debate has been going on for decades for how to interpret the Pope's silence. There are many defenders of the Pope, of Pius XII, who in fact would like to see him and are working hard to have him declared a saint, and would say that if he was silent, it was because to speak out would do more harm than good, and that he saved, some of them said, hundreds of thousands of Jews. The number keeps going up. There have been pressure for many years, now really decades, on the Vatican to open the archives particularly for the war years, to try to resolve the controversy over the Pope's role during the Holocaust in particular. Finally, Pope Francis authorized the opening of those archives, which opened on March 2nd of 2020, so just under 2 years ago. Since then, together with my colleague Roberto Benedetti, who's a historian, Italian and church historian who lives in the Rome area, I've been working in these newly available documents that we've been waiting many decades to be able to read, to shed light on what exactly the Pope did and didn't do, and also, and perhaps in particular, the kind of decision-making process that was going on behind the scenes that would motivate the Pope to take the actions that he did. I think I have here, oops, the right button. Is this, for some reason these, start the video, I don't know, the arrows are no longer working here for some reason. Get our help here. Going to work now. Okay, good. So here, actually, this is showing me, you see me there leaning over, looking at my documents. This is the first day, actually, the first minute those archives opened. Oops. On that morning, March 2nd, 2020. And actually, this man on the left, Hubert Wolf, is a very prominent church historian. He's the most prominent church historian in Germany. He's also a priest, does excellent work. And you see Herbert's Wolf is number 4 there. I'm number 6, getting in there at 8:30, the moment those archives open. Again, there have been demands for over half a century for the opening of these archives. So maybe this is a rather arcane image, but it certainly has significance for me. I'd been waiting a long time for this. In the controversy over Pius XII and the Holocaust, no episode is really, I think, more consequential for the debate and for understanding the Pope's motivations than the seizure of Rome's Jews on October 16th, 1943, a real kind of black letter day in Italian history and Jewish history, especially in Italy. What I'd like to do this evening is to give you a new account of what happened that day. There have actually been many books written about it and many articles, but none of them had the advantage of reading the kind of behind the scenes documents that one now can find in the Vatican. But although I'll highlight what will find in the Vatican, it's also important to triangulate these documents with a whole slew of other documents that one finds in other archives, so that what my talk this evening is based not only on what we've now found in these newly opened Vatican archives, but also in the Italian, French, German, British, and American archives as well. And if there are any questions about this, I'd be happy to address them later on. Well, here, by the way, as mentioned, do a little publicity for my book. I have a cover, the book. I don't have the book yet available, but that's the cover. By the time the Germans occupied Rome in September 1943, this followed shortly in the end of July 1940, well, earlier July 1943, the Allies land in Sicily and begin their very slow, bloody march up the Italian peninsula. A little over basically a couple of weeks later, Mussolini is overthrown, not coincidentally. There's 45 days of uncertain period before an armistice is signed, where basically Italy surrenders to the Allies. Of course, Italy had been part of the Axis coalition with Hitler until that point. And so Hitler then floods Italy with German troops. There already were a fair number in the peninsula since they were fighting together against the Allies till the day before. They flood tens of thousands of more German troops into Italy take over almost all of the country except the southernmost part where the Allies are beginning to establish a beachhead. And so in the wake of this occupation, the Germans immediately begin to plan the extermination of Italy's Jews. They had the extermination of Italy's Jews to the extermination of the Jews in the other lands that the Germans have occupied along with their allies. In the first days, even, there were the murder of many Jews in the north, even by Panzer, so-called Panzer divisions, who were operating without even specific instructions. So this is before the organized attempt to murder the Jews of Italy. There had been there were about 40,000 Jews in Italy at the time. A certain number of them were refugees from already German-occupied parts of it, well, Germany itself, Austria, Czechoslovakia, France, all these areas, Jews seeking to escape the Holocaust, some were flooding into Italy. So you not only had Italian Jews, but a certain number of other European Jews in Italy at the time. Within a day of the German troops' entrance into Rome, which is around September 9th, 10th of 1943, the chief rabbi of Rome, Israel Zoli, went into hiding. Here's just an image of the German tanks. Some of you who've been to Rome may recognize this Vittoriano monument in the center of Rome. Now, Rabbi Zoli had until just a few years earlier been the rabbi in Trieste in the Northeast, and he was actually from a kind of Germanic-speaking Central European background, and he had a certain amount of information from his colleagues in Central Europe, such that he urged the two lay leaders of the Jewish community of Rome to urge all Jews in Rome to go into hiding. This, the lay leaders refused to do. The rabbi, for various reasons, wasn't very popular, and probably his Germanic accent he was regarded as kind of cold personality. And so they said, the lay leader said, "Oh, we can't do that. That would create panic." Well, the results would be tragic, albeit there were limits to where Jews could go into hiding, which we can talk about as well. Jews, as many of you know, had been living in Rome for over 2,000 years. Back in the 16th century, in 1555, the then Pope Paul IV ordered all Jews to be locked up every night in a walled ghetto. This is an image of the walled ghetto on the Tiber. Now, the one thing people often don't realize as well is that this ghetto lasted until 1870. It was only in 1870 that Italian troops conquered Rome from the Pope. This was the last vestige of the Papal States. So there were people living in the Jews living in Rome at the time who had actually lived during the Papal States when Rome itself was under the control of the Pope. But because the popes had controlled Rome and because of the attitude they took toward the Jews of Rome were referred to as the Pope's Jews. So the Pope had a certain kind of proprietarial relationship with the Jews of Rome. Well, there were 12,000 Jews living in the province of Rome, about half of whom were living in the city of Rome. Most of them were actually poor, especially those living in the old ghetto. They did begin, although they didn't all go into hiding, they did begin to take precautions. They took down their mezuzahs from their doorposts. They put away their Jewish books and Hebrew, anything in Hebrew. Their Hanukkah menorahs, this sort of thing, were all stored away. Well, on September 24th, so you see how quickly events move. The Germans had just occupied Rome a couple of weeks earlier. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS from Berlin, cabled orders to the head of the SS in Rome, a man named Herbert Kappler. And the order said the following: all Jews, without regard to nationality, age, sex, or condition, must be transferred to Germany and liquidated there. This was the order sent within 2 weeks of their taking Rome. 2 days later, for reasons that still remain unclear, Kepler called in the lay heads of the Jewish community of Rome and demanded 50 kilograms of gold from them, and said that if they didn't provide the gold, 50 kilograms of gold within 48 hours, 200 Jews would be deported. Remains today, strangely, a mystery, because we found no order from Berlin for him to do this. It would actually seem rather bizarre for Hitler to have been ordered something like that. The Jews were able to take an emergency collection in the Jewish community of gold jewelry primarily, and 2 days later brought it in the requisite 50 kilograms. Some of the Jews in Rome took this as evidence that they had escaped immediate danger. This was also turned out to be a dangerous conclusion. On October 11th, Kepler received a new cable from Berlin. This one ordered, and I'm quoting from it, the immediate and complete elimination of Jewry in Italy. So you can't be any more specific or more draconian than that. At the same time, additional members of the SS were sent to Rome to help out in exterminating the Jews of Italy. So this takes us to the fateful day of October 16th, 1943. It was a cold, dark morning. It was Shabbos. It was Saturday morning, third day of Sukkot, when 100 SS officers marched double file into the old ghetto of Rome. Meanwhile, another couple hundred fanned out throughout the city, each with clipboard with names and addresses of Jews living in Rome, with orders to seize them all. Now, interestingly, the people that they would seize would be overwhelmingly women and children. I'll give you some numbers in a minute. Because the one danger that people in Rome were most worried about at the time was forced labor for men. And so the men of, from age 17 or 18 to 50 or 60, most of them had actually gone into hiding. So when the SS began banging on the doors of Jews in Rome, they found many more adult women than adult men, and of course the children. Well, as the morning progressed, the Roundup was attracting the attention, of course, of passersby, as these Jews were marched, in hastily dressed Jews, it began at 5:30 in the morning, were marched single file through the streets to collection points where they had tarpaulin covered trucks waiting to transport them to what would be their temporary destination right outside the Vatican. So let me just, this first of all is a synagogue. This was built after the end of the Papal States. It's kind of a statement that the Jews had arrived. The Jews had finally gotten equality under the end of the papal rule. And this, some of you have probably visited this. The Jewish Museum of Rome is in there as well, which has recently been redone. It's definitely worth visiting if you're there. There, I talked about Kepler, who demanded the gold and who was the head of the SS. In Rome, he would end up spending most of his life in an Italian prison after 1945 for war crimes. And not only his role in what I'm about to describe. This is a kind of dramatization of that roundup of the Jews in Rome, but it probably did look something like this. But if you read accounts, first-person accounts, witness accounts, for example, a sick, deaf 85-year-old woman is marched by along with a man, paralyzed old man in a wheelchair, is taken and hauled off into this truck. A woman holding her baby opened her blouse to show she was nursing, to try hoping to appeal to the mercy of the SS, who just poked her with his gun and moved her and her other small children into the truck. The SS led the Jews into the ones that they rounded up in the ghetto, into an excavated area below street level at the Theater of Marcellus. That again is kind of now a tourist attraction right at the ghetto. And there were these 3 or 4 tarpaulin covered trucks that were filling up and then shuttling back and forth to cross the Tiber to this military college right next to the walls of the old Vatican city walls, where the Jews were going to be held. We'll talk about what happened to them there. Some did succeed in escaping. When they first heard noises, these noises of the SS marching down the street, for example, in the ghetto, of course, many looked out their windows to see what was going on. Few had an idea of what actually was the fate they were about to meet. Some did flee and succeed, but others tried to flee and didn't. Just give you one example, a woman, Rosa Anticoli, fled her home with her 4 little children before the SS arrived to her door. She was desperately looking to get to the nearby tram station to get on and get to escape with her 4 little children, but she was slowed down because one of her little daughters was with diphtheria. And so as they were getting near the tram station, a suspicious SS officer spotted them and began yelling, "Jude, Jude, Jew." And Rosa fell on her knees, pleaded for mercy for her little children. But the SS officer simply prodded her with the butt of his rifle and directed her and her 4 little children onto the truck. In all, 1,259 people were taken from their homes that day, many from the old ghetto, but not all. They were also taken from around all over Rome. Although were trucked to the same place, that military college I mentioned. I'll show a map in a minute. There were 363 men, adult men. They were put in a separate area from the women and children. There were 689 women. So there were, what's that? Basically twice as many adult women as adult men. The oldest of the women was 90 years old. The trauma would cause one of the women who was pregnant to go into labor, and her baby would be born the next morning at the military college, leading to one additional imprisoned Jew. Pius XII, now we get to the Vatican and what it's doing here, quickly learned of the Roundup. There he is at his desk. Early that morning, we know he was notified by 7 a.m. of what was going on. He could have no doubt about the fate that the Rome's Jews would meet if they were deported, because, and we know this from various sources, but including some of these recently available documents that we found in the Vatican archives, they had very detailed reports of the Holocaust as was going on from various church sources throughout Europe. So when he heard about this, it was certainly distressing to him. It was distressing for a couple of kinds of reasons. One is just as a human being, of course, he must have been hit by it, but also because it was going to be a great embarrassment for him, which he certainly realized immediately, because he had been under pressure already for really years and certainly many months to denounce the Nazis' attempt to exterminate Europe's Jews, and he had resisted. But Rome's Jews, as I mentioned before, they were known as the Pope's Jews, and for him, for this to be taking place and the Jews to in fact be kept just outside the Vatican, awaiting their deportation, for him to continue to say nothing would be extremely difficult for him, or put him in a very difficult spot. So when the Pope found out about this, he picked up his phone and he called his Secretary of State, his kind of number 2 man, Cardinal Maglione. And I think I have, there he is, Cardinal Luigi Maglione, and said, this is terrible. Call in the German ambassador to the Holy See and see what you can do. And kind of amazingly, Cardinal Maglione provided a transcript, essentially, of his subsequent conversation later that day. This is October 16th, the same days are being rounded up, with the German ambassador. And the German ambassador of the Holy See is actually a very important personage. His name was von Weizsäcker. Weizsäcker had been the number 2 to Ribbentrop in the foreign ministry. His position had been state secretary throughout the first years of the war. And he had only recently, a couple of months earlier, been sent from Berlin to become the German ambassador to the Holy See. So he was a very high-ranking person in the Third Reich. I'll show you his picture in a few minutes. So this conversation that Cardinal has, as the Jews are still, maybe the last ones are just being brought over to the military college, but before anything is done with them, we have this transcript that Cardinal Maglione himself provided. And so, and I'd like to quote from it here. I think it's quite revealing. He, in meeting with the ambassador, he appeals to his sense of Christian charity and humanity, asking if he might not intervene. Quote, this is Cardinal Maglione speaking, "Excellency, you who have a tender, good heart, see if you can't save so many innocents. It is painful for the Holy Father, painful beyond all measure, that in Rome itself, under the eyes of the common Father, that's the Pope, so many people are made to suffer simply because they belong to a particular race." So Weizsäcker, hearing this, reflects for a moment. And then he says, or he asks a question. He says, what would the Holy See do if things were to continue? How does Cardinal Maglione respond to that? He says, remember, this is Maglione himself writing this down, and then I'm quoting. The Holy See, Maglione says, would not want to be constrained to say a word of disapproval. To that, the Hitler's ambassador says, it has been more than 4 years that I have been following and admiring the Holy See's attitude. It has succeeded in steering the ship amidst rocks of every kind and every size without any collisions. And even if it had more faith in the Allies, and by the way, by this time, it's pretty clear the Allies are going to win the war, the Germans are going to lose the war. Earlier on, if you look at the Pope's motivations, an important part was in the early years of the war, the Pope thought Hitler was going to win the war. Oh, we could talk about that later too, if anyone would like. And so Weizsäcker goes on, he says, I asked myself whether right at the time that the boat is about to reach port, is it a good idea to put everything in danger? I think of the consequences that a step by the Holy See would provoke. The instructions received, he added, come from the highest source, namely, he's informing the Cardinal Secretary of State, the order came from Hitler to exterminate the Jews of Rome and of Italy. After a pause to let the Cardinal reflect on what the German ambassador had told him, Weizsäcker asked, does your eminence leave me free not to report this official conversation? That is not to bring any even verbal protest to the attention of Berlin. And again, this is, I'm quoting from Maglione's own account. He writes, I observed that I had asked him to intervene by appealing to his sense of humanity. I left it to his judgment whether or not to mention our conversation, which had been so friendly. Maglione then went on to assure the German ambassador that, as Weizsäcker himself had noted, the Holy See had always been careful not to give offense to the Germans. Not, as Maglione put it, and again I'm quoting him, to have done even the least thing against Germany during a terrible war, unquote. Meanwhile, again quoting the Cardinal, he says, I repeat, Your Excellency told me he would do something for the poor Jews. I thank you for it. As for the rest, I leave it to your judgment. If you think it more opportune not to mention our conversation, so be it. Again, this is Malione's own account of that conversation. And there's the German ambassador, Ernst von Weizsäcker, I mentioned, had been state secretary. He would be tried for war crimes at Nuremberg after the war, not for what he did in Rome or in Italy, but what he had done beforehand and in his role as the #2 to Ribbentrop in Berlin. In fact, Weizsäcker, although Malione said he somehow promised to do something to help the poor Jews, he never made such a promise. What he did do was inform Berlin the next day that the Vatican was, quote, and this we have from his report to Berlin, from the Berlin archives, that the Vatican was, quote, particularly shocked that the action took place, so to speak, under the Pope's windows. And he said that groups hostile to the Germans were trying to exploit the roundup of the Jews, quote, to force the Vatican out of its reserve. He added that people were beginning to contrast the silence of the Pope, Pius XII, with, as he put it, his, quote, his much more fiery predecessor, Pius XI. Meanwhile, at the military college, where these 1,260 or so Jews had been forced, they were made to sleep on the floor. They were given no food or anything to drink. It would have been hard for them to sleep anyway because of the incessant weeping of the people there and especially the young children, and the pangs of hunger, the stench because they weren't given any lavatory access either. All wondered, of course, what was going to become to them, although most imagined some kind of work camp. Very few could actually, and perhaps this is surprising to us knowing what was going on elsewhere in Europe and what would happen to them. But very few of them at the time could contemplate what actually was about to happen to them. Here is a map. This is a map from my new book. It'll be coming out. That's why you see it's a kind of two-page map. But and you see in the upper left there the Vatican area, kind of highlighted in dark, and right under it the arrow pointing to where the military college where the Jews were being held. So you see how close this is. The ghetto would be right at the kind of the bottom of the middle of the map. Give you a little bit of orientation. Well, as the 1,000+ terrified Jews waited a few hundred meters from the Vatican, pleas kept coming into the Pope to do something. On the day after the roundup, 17th, the Jews are still being held there, Pius XII received an urgent letter. These are what I'm talking about now are all new revelations from these recently opened archives. Pius XII received an urgent letter from a group of Roman Jews who had eluded capture, begging him to intervene. He was the only person they could turn to. Nobody else, there was no other political authority other than the Germans, but the Pope occupied a especially hallowed position, of course, in Rome, and he was the one source of authority that they thought the only possibility they had to save the Jews who'd been captured. The same day as that group of Jews who had eluded capture begged the Pope to intervene, he received, incredibly, found in the archives, a letter from a woman from within the military college. Somehow someone smuggled it out for her. And again, she pleaded with the Pope to do something, use what she called his authoritative intervention. At the same time, or shortly thereafter, other Roman Jews reached the Vatican Secretary of State to plead for papal help on behalf of their family members who had been taken. That morning, so this is the morning following the taking of the Jews, the morning of Sunday, October 17th, Monsignor Montini, who's an important part of this story. You see him here with the Pope. He was in the Secretary of State. He was right under Malione. Remember, Malione, Luigi Malione was the Cardinal Secretary of State. He had two kind of deputies, one of whom was the man who was actually closest to the heart of the Pope and who would succeed him after one other person, Angelo Roncalli, becomes John the 23rd. He then becomes Paul the 6th, would eventually become Pope, and he becomes central to this story as well of October 16th. So Monsignor Montini is able to send a Monsignor to the place of the Jews' imprisonment to see what's happening, what their situation is. He reports back about how they haven't had anything to eat or drink. As he's arriving, a group of doctors are leaving. They had been treating some of the Jews who had been beaten up at the time they were being arrested. But he learned something else of interest, which will become central to the story and central, I think, to the revelations now available in these newly accessible archives. That is that it seems the Monsignor in his report to Montini, and I'm quoting from the report he sends in to him, according to some who were outside and new people in turn there, that they also included people who had already been baptized, confirmed, and celebrated a church wedding, unquote. In fact, among those rounded up were quite a few Christians, that is, Jews who had been baptized, because those other chapters of my book, but you had something that's kind of embarrassing in Jewish history and therefore severely understudied. Namely, throughout Europe, tens of thousands of Jews were rushing to the baptismal font to try in some hope to escape the fate that Jews were, as they were being slaughtered. And this was true in Italy as well, where thousands of Jews had been baptized beginning in 1938 when the racial laws had been introduced by Mussolini. So it turns out there were a fairly substantial number of Jews who had been baptized, who had been taken. And the second category, interestingly, which was Jews who had married Catholics and promised that their children would be raised as Catholic. The Vatican, this is who the Vatican did take action for over action over the next hours. So, for example, within hours of the arrests, at 7 a.m. that morning, when the roundup began around 5:30 or 6 in the morning, by 7, a man was already in the Vatican. He was actually an employee of the Vatican Library, but who knew Monsignor Montini, and he writes down a quick plea to him to do something. This too is in the newly available archive, newly open. He writes, "I turn to your excellency," to Montini, "with the most fervent prayer to use your authority with the German embassy so that Catholic people and fervent Catholics like my aunt and my cousins are saved. It is an intervention that cannot come quickly enough if, God willing, it is not already too late." So he had, among his relatives were some in this category, for example, an uncle, I mean, he was Catholic and from a Catholic family, but his uncle had married a Jewish woman who got baptized and were raising their children as Catholics. At the same time, Monsignor Montini learned of another such case and wrote a hasty note to the Vatican Secretary of State. This is now a letter that Montini writes at this time to Cardinal Maglione. He says, "This morning, the lawyer Foligno," this is his last name, Foligno, "was taken, Catholic by birth, with his Arian wife and children." I just wrote a journal article about the quick adoption in the Vatican of the terminology of non-Aryans for Jews. But again, that's a somewhat separate story. A note 3 days later reported the good news, again, in these newly available archives, quote, "Mr. Foligno comes to the Secretariat." This man who was actually seized and was in that military college with the 1,000+ Jews. Once the German embassy heard from the Vatican that he was Catholic, was freed. And says, and then he comes to give his thanks directly to the Vatican. He said, "Mr. Foligno comes to the Secretariat to give thanks for what has been done for him. He was liberated after only a few hours," unquote. The day after the roundup, the Roman office of the Order of Malta advised the Vatican Secretary of State of another such case. Although the man in question had a Jewish father, the letter explained, he had been baptized at birth. yet he had been seized in the German raid too. 3 days later, the Office of the Order of Malta, again, these are documents we now can read in the Vatican archives, the Order of Malta followed up with a letter reporting that the Germans' error had been rectified. Quote, fortunately for him, before embarking for an unknown destination, he was let go. In fact, what we've discovered in these archives is that the Vatican Secretariat had hastily drawn up a list of all those among the imprisoned whom the church deemed Catholic and given it to the German ambassador to Weizsäcker, who we saw a moment ago. Early on Sunday, the day after the roundup, the Germans began systematically reviewing the documents, the identity papers of their Jewish captives to determine who could be considered Catholic and therefore could be allowed to, could be released. Over the next hours, they would not only release the Jews who had been baptized, but also those, as I mentioned, who were married to Catholics. Now, this seems surprising to some. We hear so much about how, from the Nazis' point of view, it has nothing to do with religion. It's all about genetics or ancestry. But in Rome, certainly, the situation was different because the Germans were heavily invested, the Nazis were heavily invested in keeping amicable relations with the Vatican. And so this was an effort that they made in this case, and it resulted in the fact that about 250 of those people they took were released under, as a result, in good part of the list that the Vatican provided of who was actually Catholic from their point of view. Beginning at dawn on Monday, October 18th, so 2 days after they were captured, the remaining 1,007 Jews were put in trucks, which then rumbled through Rome's cobblestone streets on the way to the Tiburtina train station, where a long train of 18 cattle cars was waiting for them. Trucks pulled up beside the cattle cars, windowless cattle cars, and the Jews were forced in, including that child who had been born the previous day. And they would then begin their trip that afternoon north, their destination. Well, of course, they had no idea what their destination was. Along the way, we have reports at various train stations in Italy of these kind of plaintive pleas coming from these windowless cattle cars as they stopped at stations along the way up north. Monsignor, well, also it's worth mentioning that among the passengers, the 1,007 included 105 children under age 5. Monsignor Montini met with Pius XII that same day, the same day the train pulls out, to ask how he should reply to a letter that relatives of the captured Jews had sent the previous day, while the Jews were still there, pleading for the Pope to intervene. The Pope instructed, quote, this is again from newly opened or newly available archives of the Vatican, Pope instructed them, quote, let them know that one is doing everything that one can, unquote. The day after the trainload of Jews left, a member of the Vatican Secretariat of State office handed the German ambassador to the Vatican, Weizsäcker, the latest Vatican list of those who had been seized, who should have been considered Catholic and therefore should have been let go. That letter, so this is the Vatican Secretary of State letter sent to the German ambassador to the Holy See the day the Jews go off in the train. Quote, among the various cases of non-Aryans not previously made known to the German embassy, there are the two attached. They involve non-Aryans who have been baptized, but not freed as others have been in their condition, unquote. It was too late for those people, whether or not they were baptized. It was still dark The morning of October 23rd, which is exactly a week from the roundup of the Jews in Rome. That morning, October 23rd, when the train pulls into Auschwitz, as the disoriented, exhausted, freezing, filthy Jews, Jewish captives, stepped out of the train, they were met by one of the camp's physicians, a man whose name some of you may recognize, Joseph Mengele. He, by the way, would never be punished. I won't go into what some of his experiments consisted of on the Jewish captives, particularly children. But as they stepped out, the first thing that they did is, because families had been separated, they began to run to try to find, where are my children? Where's my wife? Where's my husband? But they're immediately told to freeze, not to move. And Mengele himself divides them to those he regards as able to do forced labor in a productive way, which are a minority of the adults and mostly men, and the great majority of those, including all the older people, all the children, and those who looked more sickly or infirm, they were told to go on the other side. The elderly, the children, the sick, and the fragile, the great majority, were then immediately loaded onto trucks and taken directly to the gas chamber. They didn't live 24 hours after arriving at Auschwitz. The youngest of their murder victims was that child who had been born less than a week earlier at the military college in Rome. Slave laborers would later remove the gold teeth from their bodies. The rest of the Jews, 149 men and 47 women, were sent to a labor camp where most of them would die from disease, exhaustion, frostbite, starvation. Of the 1,007 who arrived at Auschwitz, only 16 would survive the war. I think it's important to put faces on these people, and it's a bit of an abstraction. And so I just have a couple of slides with some of the people that I'm talking about here. This woman, Elena Spizzichino, and her 7-year-old daughter were among those who were taken and sent to their death at Auschwitz. This is a picture taken of her a few years earlier. Or just show you one other slide. I mean, I find these hard to take myself. Some idea of the children who were taken and who were immediately sent to the gas chambers on their arrival at Auschwitz that day. On the day the Jews were being forced onto the train in Rome, Francis D'Arcy Osborne, who was a British envoy to the Vatican and living at the time in Vatican City, had a long audience with Pius XII. It was October 18th. He wrote in his report, which I read in from the archives in London, he said the Pope appeared, quote, well and in good spirits, unquote. He shared two concerns with him, neither of which had to do with what had just happened. And Osborne asked the Pope whether the Germans were treating the Vatican well. He replied, and this is, I'm quoting from Osborne's report to London, that he, quote, he had no grounds for complaint against General von Stahel, who's the head of the German military in Rome, and the German police, who had hitherto respected neutrality, unquote. The next day, the American envoy to the Holy See, who likewise was forced to be living in Vatican City because they were both regarded, of course, as enemy aliens, he had an audience with the Pope, coincidentally. And he offered similar, the Pope made no mention of what had just happened to the Jews in Rome. And furthermore, and here I'm quoting from his report, which you find in the National Archives at College Park in Maryland, he says the Pope took the opportunity to tell him, quote, that so far the Germans had respected the Vatican City and the Holy See's property in Rome, and that the German general officer commanding in Rome seemed well disposed toward the Vatican, unquote. So in neither of these two meetings coming October 18th, October 19th, did the Pope mention to anything, or either didn't mention anything about what had just happened or was regarded as too inconsequential to both envoys to mention in their reports back home. Meanwhile, Rome's Jews who had not been picked up were on the run. And there are many scenes I could describe, just one snippet. The day after the train departed, in one of many such cases, a nun responded to a knock on her convent door in Rome, and she found a young couple holding, the woman holding a baby in her arms. And she holds out the baby, and her husband says to the nun, take him. And this is a report from the church, not from the Jews. Take him, and if you like, baptize him. If you don't take him, I will kill him and kill myself. This is an account by a high Vatican official who talked to the nun, and in his kind of the diary, he says, the child remained with the nuns, and the two forlorn Jews vanished, looking to escape from the Gestapo. Well, pleas from the Rome's Jews kept coming into the Pope because they didn't know what had happened to their family members and friends and so on who had gone off on that train. Nobody announced what their destination was. On October 27th, a Roman rabbi, David Panzieri, wrote directly to the Pope, begging him to convince the Germans to return the victims of the Roundup, not realizing that most had already been incinerated. Yet the Vatican's main focus, and again, we know this from the recently opened archives, in the days following the Roundup, was to alert the German authorities to the fact that despite their earlier efforts to identify them, there were quite a few baptized Jews that had been erroneously taken. On October 29th, Cardinal Maglione's office sent Weizsäcker, the German ambassador, a typical appeal. And again, I think I have this from the Berlin archives. So what does his appeal say? This is now over a week after the Jews are taken. And so it's interesting too that the Vatican did not know and would not know for many months what had happened to these Jews in particular. So Maglione's office writes to the German ambassador, the most excellent German ambassador of the Holy See is asked for his benevolent interest in the release of Count Victor Cantoni and his mother, who were deported by the German troops from Rome, where they live, to an unknown destination. Count Cantoni, Catholic, was baptized 30 years ago as a child, and his mother was baptized in 1927, unquote. A week later, writing on behalf of all those who yesterday, Maglione sent a letter to the German ambassador. He asked if it were possible for him to satisfy the, quote, this is Cardinal Maglione writing, the many relatives or friends of the non-Aryans recently arrested in Rome who would like to have news of their loved ones and eventually to have some material help. At the same time, and we know this from documents we've found in the Berlin archives, Weizsäcker wrote with good news to Berlin, to the command center of Third Reich, the good news that the Pope had decided to say nothing about the roundup of the Jews of Rome. And here, let me quote from him, put him back up there, looking at his window. So this is now what we found in Berlin archives, Weizsäcker's report to a couple of weeks after the Jews were taken back to Berlin. He says, although he has been beseeched by various parties to do so, the Pope has refrained from making any ostentatious remarks on the deportation of the Jews from Rome. Even though he must expect to be criticized for this for a long time by our enemies, and by Protestant circles in Anglo-Saxon countries will exploit this for propaganda purposes. On this issue too, he has done everything possible not to strain relations with the German government and the German authorities in Rome, unquote. One of the most remarkable documents I think I found in these newly open archives was the report that the chaplain with the SS in Rome complained to the chaplain with the Italian police of Rome, saying that there were a number of German forces, German military in Rome, who were not that happy about getting involved, having to be involved in deporting the Jews, and were shocked that the Pope had never said anything about it. And so this Italian priest, the chaplain of the Rome's police, writes to the Vatican to report on this. And on this document is scrawled a comment, internal comment, I don't know whether it's by Montini or by someone else in the Secretary of State office. And it simply said, quote, this is how they should respond to the priest who brought this report to them. Quote, Holy See has done what it could, unquote. Well, over the following months of German occupation of Rome, another 1,000 Jews would be seized from Rome and sent to their death mainly at Auschwitz. Thousands more from further north in Italy. Some of you read or seen the movie Garden of the Finzi-Contini, for example, which portrayed what happened in Ferrara. Thousands more Jews in Italy over the next months would be rounded up and deported to their death in these extermination camps. Pius XII still judged it best not to speak out. Among other reasons for silence, so we can talk more about this, and there are actually a number of reasons for silence, but one was this, that the Third Reich at this point was about 50% Catholic. And we know now from these internal documents newly available in the Vatican archives that the Pope was very concerned that if you were to criticize the Nazis, I mean, who were the Nazis? That there were, of course, mostly people who thought themselves as good Christians. And that if you were to criticize them, this would antagonize the Catholics of Germany and perhaps even produce a schism in the church. And this he wanted to avoid at all costs. For the rest of the story, this is basically what I talked about today is one out of 40 chapters in this book. But those who are interested, this will be out in June. So thank you for listening, and eager to hear any questions for those here or those zooming in. Thank you.
Okay, do we have questions from the audience? Let's begin with you.
So my question is,
Hold it close, please. Yeah.
okay. So we know that eventually Hitler did gather up the Catholics, right? And so,
No, what do you mean gather up the Catholics?
and put them into the work camps also.
No, half the population of Germany were Catholic. They couldn't gather up the Catholics. Who do you think was killing the Jews? It was Protestants and Catholics.
Okay.
Yeah, so no, I don't want to be, dismissive, but this, now it's true, it wasn't just Jews who died in the concentration camps. Perhaps this is what you're getting at. I mean, there were many priests, for example, especially Polish priests, who were regarded as the enemy by the Nazis. And so, for example, particularly in the parts of Poland that they would annex, one of the things they would do is arrest all the priests who were seen as nationalists and cart in German Catholic priests to take their place in their parishes and send those Polish priests to concentration camps, and a certain number died there. But there was no generic arresting of Catholics, much less sending them to their death.
Other comments? Okay.
Thank you for your talk, and your book on the Pope and Mussolini was excellent. My question is, in your research, have you uncovered any connection? Pius XII, before he was made the Pope, he was a cardinal to Germany, wasn't he?
He was nuncio to Germany. It was before he became cardinal.
Yes. So was there that, I just seem to think that you can't help but overlook collusion there, like having that connection prior. And I don't know if you uncovered anything in your research.
Yes. So Celli, who was who becomes Pope Pius XII, was from 1917 to 1929. So 12 years he spent in Germany as papal nuncio, like the ambassador, basically from the Vatican to Germany. So he, among other things, was fluent in German, knew Germany very well, and kept talking about how fond he was of Germany. You may also have in mind, John Cornwell wrote a book with a rather provocative title, Hitler's Pope. It came out, was a bestseller about 20 years ago. And that focuses a lot on that period. He wasn't Hitler's Pope. He did not like Nazis. I mean, from the Vatican's point of view, the Nazis were persecuting the church in Germany, were eroding its power. For example, in Bavaria, the heavily Catholic, at the time Hitler comes to power in 1933, I think it's something like 2/3 of all the children are in Catholic parochial schools. This Hitler couldn't abide, so that by the end of the 30s, there was maybe 5% of the kids there were in parochial schools. So this kind of thing and others led the Pope to, and others in the Vatican, to be anti-Hitler, but Hitler knew how to intimidate them. And I'm referring to people in the Vatican, including the Pope. So so I would say he was certainly influenced. Every time he met with a Nazi visitor, he would talk about how fond he was of the Germans, what wonderful people the Germans were. And in fact, I found one quoted in one of these documents as saying, if only they left the church alone in Germany, and he's saying this in the middle of the war, I'm happier about Germany than I am. So, this some of his thinking.
Thank you. I actually have two questions that are totally unrelated. So I will ask one and ask for your response in the second one. You talked about at the time of the Roundup that there was a preponderance of women and children. What about the resistance and the Jewish partisans? This is by 1943. Partisans and the resistance had pretty much undertaken a particular organization, a particular mission and purpose. Did your research indicate that the men who were not there were part of the partisans, part of the resistance?
Well, the resistance was only just barely getting going. I mean, the Germans had just taken over Italy. There hadn't been resistance when was fighting on behalf of Hitler, as part of the Axis, the early years of the war. There was no resistance in Italy. But once Germany does occupy the country, there would be the beginning, in the fall of 43 would be the beginning of the resistance. But the time of the Roundup of the Jews, October 16th, is a little bit early, really, for any organized resistance. Eventually, a certain number of Jews, both men and women, would join the resistance and participate in it.
And my second question deals with the relationship of the deportations. You talked about the one in Rome in October of 1943. It's just a few months after the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. Just before that was the liquidation of Lowe to Lowe and Krakow to Auschwitz. Can you draw any relationships or any parallels between the time windows here, the time frames?
The gas chambers in Auschwitz had begun operating about a year before the Jews were taken. So, the Jews who showed up there for Mengele on October 23rd were, part of a kind of long line. What was unusual is having a large number come from Italy. That would be, recent. And there, so it's, one other thing that might be said is that the Jews were 0.1% of the population of Italy. They were 10% of the population of Poland, as perhaps you know. So there were 3,300,000 roughly Jews in Poland at the time the Holocaust began, and 90% of them, so 3 million, are murdered. And in Italy, they're just 40,000, more or less altogether. And I think it's about a little 8,000 would end up murdered. So, putting it into context, Italy, and this is often said about Italy, I think sometimes in a rather misleading way, that, Jews did relatively well in Italy compared to places like Poland and other parts of Europe.
Thank you.
Lisa, let's see a few questions from the online audience.
Okay.
Okay.
Is it true that the Pope was predisposed to anti-Semitism from his roles in Germany and Poland before the war? Was he anti-Semitic?
The question is, was the Pope anti-Semitic? Well, I think the Pope shared in the general anti-Semitism of the church at the pre-Second Vatican Council church. So I should say this, that with the Second Vatican Council, the church dramatically renounced its demonization of the Jews that had gone on for hundreds of years. So we're not talking about the current church, but we are talking about World War II. And, one of the things that I delve with quite a bit in my book, deal with quite a bit in the book, are what we've recently found in these newly open archives about the discussions going on behind the scenes about whether to protest and so on. And there it's very clear, for example, one of the top advisors of the Pope, there's a request actually through Angelo Roncalli, who will become John the 23rd and responsible for the Second Vatican Council and responsible for changing this. He's in Turkey as the papal delegate there, and he writes for these Jews who are trying to flee Central Europe that they need a passage to Palestine. And of course, the Vatican was opposed to a Jewish state, Jewish presence in Palestine. And you read what the High Monsignor in the Secretary of State office is writing. He says, the Jews are a bunch of swindlers. And so they're happy when they're living among Christians because they have plenty of people to swindle. But the Jews haven't wanted, until Hitler anyway, to go to Palestine because they'd only be a bunch of swindlers, so there'd be nobody to swindle. So you have this kind of document. And that, so I think the Pope, I don't think he was an outlier. He was part of that kind of mentality about Jews. So I don't think that's the main reason why he doesn't protest. So I wouldn't explain it by anti-Semitism per se, but it was part of the general kind of worldview.
Okay. Another question was, what was the general treatment of Jews under Mussolini prior to the German occupation?
Right. I mean, this is interesting to me because I think Italians have tried to remake their history. They're not, of course, the only people who've tried to do this. But these days, if you go to Italy, you could easily get the impression in World War II, Italy sided with the Allies and not with Hitler. And right after the war, immediately they started to deny what's kind of undeniable. In 1938, the fascist state, Italy, introduced the racial laws. So what were the racial laws? Well, for example, all Jewish children were thrown out of the public schools. All Jewish teachers were fired. All Jewish, essentially professionals lost their jobs. So Jewish workers in state institutions and parastatal institutions, banks, insurance companies, they were all let go. That's 1938. This is before, before Italy only gets in the war 2 years later. So, so there was serious persecution of Italy's Jews, as there was, by the way, in a number of other pre-World War II places, including Poland, including Romania, including Hungary, had all introduced, unrelated to the Nazis, these serious persecutory measures against Jews, all of which were, by the way, applauded in the Vatican and seen as putting into practice what the popes had taught for centuries, that it was dangerous for Jews to be in social interaction with Christians and be kept isolated.
These are two questions that are kind of similar. I'm going to ask them together so that you can answer them together. In reviewing the papal archives, did you find any indication that documents had been edited or withheld? And then the other person wants to know whether there were signs or records that the Vatican, who have defended the Pope over the decades, have ever looked at the records. So.
Well, this is, a big discussion among, I think, more serious scholars working in these archives. It has been for a long time in Vatican archives, but probably not just that. It's not just the Vatican that tries to protect its reputation, but confining ourselves to the question of the Vatican at the moment, there's always some concern that there are particularly embarrassing kinds of records that have somehow been taken away. We had a discussion about the archives at noon today at ASU, and I mentioned that the Mussolini had secret police archives, informants. He had thousands of informants around the country, including many he was particularly interested in the Vatican, and compiling thick folders on the major personages. And these included the man who would become Pius XII, as well as someone like Monsignor Montini, who would become Pope Paul VI. If you go to the state archives today and look for those files amongst the thousands of other files that are still there, you won't find them. They're gone. Who took them when? We can only speculate. So it's not just the Vatican archives that are a problem for historians dealing with this history. And in general, I would say this, that the Vatican is to be commended for the seriousness with which it treats its own history. And I mean, there are millions of documents that are just made available for the papacy of Pius XII. There's still a question of whether there's certain ones missing, but I would say that if they were trying to take away embarrassing materials, there are an awful lot of materials I found that wouldn't be there.
And was he ever canonized?
No, so there's I tell people, those of you who are on Twitter, if you tweet or put search Pius XII on any given day, typically half the tweets, and there'll be many of them for Pius XII, mentioning Pius XII, half of them will tell you that Pius XII was the last pope. That because with John the 23rd, the Second Vatican Council, from the right wing of the Catholic Church, that's where the church went wrong. These people say that there's been no legitimate pope after Pius XII. So John Paul II was eager to canonize, beatify, then canonize, make a saint of Pius XII, but partly because of protests from the Jewish community in Rome, the decision was made to delay until the opening of the archives could prove from the Vatican's point of view what a heroic figure Pius XII was and what a great savior of Jews he was. So he's been declared venerable, which is kind of a stepping stone, but he's not there yet.
There's a few more questions. Should I keep asking or?
We have one here
let's
too,
go
maybe.
Back to the room and then we'll come back
back.
to. There's a few more.
What happened to these issues after the Allies were victorious, moving up the peninsula, and the Pope was there, and the Allies were in charge or taking charge of Italy? What happened to the issues? Were they buried, or how were they dealt with or not dealt with?
Well, I mean, there are different aspects to this. One of the terms, actually, the armistice in September, is announced September 8th of 1943, that the Allies insisted on was the abrogation of the racial laws, which in fact the royal government, which was now living in a enclave in the extreme south of Italy, protected by the Allies, was not in any hurry to deal with. And in fact, in the 2 weeks after Mussolini was deposed, the man who, it's actually a Jesuit priest named Tacchi Venturi, was the go-between between the Pope and Mussolini. He had very good contacts in the government. He contacted the Pope essentially and said, look, now that Mussolini's government's fallen, we can approach the new government. This is in the 45 days, this is now an autonomous post-fascist government before the Germans arrived. He said, this Jesuit priest tells the Pope, the Secretary of State and the Pope, we can finally get the changes made we want in the racial laws. What were the changes they want in the racial laws? It was that for the most part, they're great, but that we've been complaining since the beginning of them that they have an impact on people who should be treated as Catholic, not as Jews. Namely, these baptized Jews who were, because of the marriage restrictions, not able to legally marry. So a baptized Jew could not marry a legitimate Catholic according to the racial laws. And this, from the Pope's point of view and the Vatican's point of view, was terrible, both because it went against kind of canon law or doctrine that baptized Jews should be regarded as a Catholic, but also because the Lateran Accords that they had entered into, the Vatican entered into in 1929 with Mussolini, which established Vatican City, which did not exist before then, gave the church the ability that said basically that any church wedding would be immediately accepted by the state, and it went against that. So, I mean, there are many aspects of this, but that's just a couple of what was happening as the Allies would begin to march forth. But a lot of the murder of the Jews of Italy would be taking place even after the Allies had liberated Rome. So they liberate Rome in early June of 1944, but the Germans are going to control like a third of the northern part of Italy for another year, essentially. And during that year, there's been the order that even by the Italian fascist government, kind of public government he's heading, that all the Jews should be sent to concentration camps where they would then be sent off to the extermination camps. So that's still going on, and the Pope still remains silent about that.
Thank you.
I have a question, and I just wanted to know how did this become a passion of yours?
Yeah, well, there are different ways I could answer that. One is that in the introduction, my father was mentioned, and my father was actually the Jewish chaplain in the US Army that landed at Anzio Beachhead to liberate Rome, and spent some months under fire at Anzio before he was with the US troops on the day they liberated Rome. And then a few days later, when they opened up the Grand Temple that I showed you before, the synagogue, he co-conducted with the chief rabbi of Rome the first service held in any liberated synagogue in Europe. So I kind of grew up with stories about some of these things that we're talking about. He also, though, after the war, as I think Hava mentioned, became the first director of interreligious affairs for the American Jewish Committee. And his main job was to work with priests and ministers, both Catholic and Protestant, to deal with the problem of demonization of Jews in Christian, for example, Sunday school materials. And so he, devoted quite a few years of his life to that. So perhaps ironically, one of the things we have is a medallion that the Vatican awarded him for his work in interreligious understanding of the war. That's part of the explanation anyway.
I'm gonna do two questions from here and then I'll go to you and then that'll be the last question. And these are the two last questions from online. Did the Pope support covert action to help the Jews, e.g. non-official help and aiding of resistance efforts, or was the extent of his protest denouncing the treatment of people on the basis of race? Or you didn't know?
Yes, well, I think the last phrase is related to his Christmas address in December of 1942 is often cited by those who would take a more positive view, put it that way, of Pius XII, and is how he reacted to the kinds of events I've been describing. And buried, page 17, there's a sentence about lamenting the mistreatment of people simply based on their race and so on. But as I said, the word Jew never escaped his lips during the Holocaust. And you have to understand and maybe this was implicit in some of my description, but at the time of the events that I'm mainly focusing on today, October 16th, the Germans were occupying Rome. And so it was kind of mutually beneficial, both from the Pope's point of view to the Vatican and to the German military, to have cooperative relations, amicable relations, because there was some worry on the part of the Vatican that the Vatican could be invaded, churches could be taken over and so forth. And on the other hand, the Germans were, how were they justified, by the way, the campaign against Jews in Italy and the racial laws? It was by referring to the popes and and quoting from Catholic publications and so forth. So the Nazis were, perhaps seems odd today to think of this, were trying to portray themselves as defenders of Christian Europe, particularly against the communist threat, which the Allies were, of course, part of the communist threat because they were allied with Soviet Union. So it was the interest of the Germans as well, not to be seen as having a conflictual relationship with the Vatican.
Okay, and finally, what was the Pope's role in letting Nazis escape after the war, otherwise known as the Rat Line?
Yes, there's been a lot of interest in this, the Rat Line. I mentioned, where is he here? Oh, this guy. What happened to Joseph Mengele? He was, and I'm not an expert on this, or the Rat Line, which is after the war. Perhaps I may turn to that next, but I haven't. Well, Mengele is a good example. The Rat Line that, and there are many other folks, including Italian fascists, who escaped to South America and are helped. Various people are helping them, but among them are high church officials. Whether the Pope had any direct knowledge of this remains kind of controversial. It's not something I've looked at, but I can't say that there's any evidence that the Pope himself was involved in any way. But there were, for example, there's a famous German bishop Bishop Hudal in Rome, who's head of the German church in Rome, and he played a key role in the Rat Line that's been well documented to spirit basically Nazi war criminals, largely South America, but also to other destinations.
This is more comment than a question. My mother's family, part of it is from northern Italy, and her cousins were hiding in a monastery with fake papers. They were from Udine, but they were not in the area because they could be recognized. So they were somewhere around in Tuscany. And so the boy who was 16, 17 was dressed as a priest.
Mm-hmm.
And they all survived. Actually, one is still alive. Bertie is now 90. And she extensively wrote about that when she was expelled from the school for racial laws. And that. Yeah. So there were cases, the monasteries kept them. They treated them so-so, but at least they survived.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they were not abused.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. In fact, there were thousands of Jews in Italy were saved in Catholic institutions, monasteries, and especially convent. Now, part of the controversy has been, did the Pope instruct, this is his working behind the scenes, and there's been absolutely no evidence that this was the result of, a papal directive. And we do have all sorts of testimony from Italian Jews who went to convents and monasteries and were turned away. The one hand, there's another kind of problem from a historian's point of view is the people who survived to tell these stories are the ones who were helped. The people who went to, a religious institution or elsewhere asking for help and turned away and sent off to their death aren't around to tell us what happened. But it is important to recognize, by the way, when we talk, I think often, at least among Jewish historians, one thing that's just a natural is to, when we talk about Jews being protected in religious institutions in Italy and elsewhere, thinking that that's all protected. If you look at these monasteries, for example, the great majority of the refugees would not be Jewish. They'd be, if we're talking about Rome, Roman, largely men who didn't want to be drafted into either forced labor or into the Nazi puppet Italian government. And so it was the policy of many of these monasteries, religious institutions to take in refugees. And for many of them, Jews would fall into that category. And so there were many Italian Jews who, owe their life to, exactly such safety.
So for our concluding question or comment, Mr. Ron Lowe, who is the founder of this, the Lowe Endowment for Holocaust and Genocide Education, I'm asking it in his name. So he would like to thank you for presenting this evening and for your very tremendous scholarship or scholarly contribution over the years. The Lowe Foundation provides support for this evening was established to foster understanding and to disseminate knowledge about the causes and conditions that foster genocides, including the Holocaust. So the question that he poses to you is this: what insight has your scholarship concerning Catholics given you as to positive action that can be taken to minimize the likelihood of future abhorrent behavior and genocides in particular? And the follow-up question to this would be, what additional scholarship and what additional presentations or conferences ASU could or should sponsor in order to further the purposes of the Lowe Endowment? So if you could respond to both questions.
Okay. Well, it seems to me first of all, it is important, even in this limited case, I realize the question is opening this up much more broadly, but even in the limited case of Christianity and the Holocaust, it's not just the Catholic Church. I mean, in Germany, the Protestant church is not just Germany, and not just the Roman Catholic Church, but if one looks in Romania and other places, some of the Eastern Church, Christian churches, there have been centuries of demonization of Jews, and it made it a lot easier for people to participate in murdering Jewish little children and old people and so on. So but opening up to, I think, what's the spirit of his question, which is, today, what are the lessons and what could universities contribute? It seems to me it's a question of looking at whether religious group or racial group or whatever group becomes demonized by some other group, whether that group is a religion or has some other kind of identity. And so certainly from a point of view anti-Semitism, it's something various Jewish organizations have been very concerned about, identifying sources of demonization, whether in the Muslim world or elsewhere in the world, well beyond Christianity. And but we can look beyond that to other groups that have been demonized, whether immigrant groups or other kinds of groups around the world, or ethnic groups in certain parts of the world. So it seems to me it's essential for universities to both sponsor research so we can identify and better understand and therefore be able to combat the kind of demonization that takes place that seems to be, so, unfortunately prevalent in so many forms in so many parts of the world, to understand it better, to be able to deal with it, but also to inform students, college students and others, and adult education about the extent of how this is still taking place. That it's not just something that happened, back in 1939 to 45.
All right, so let's please join me in thanking Professor Kurtzer for this very informed and informative lecture.
Thank you.